The bicycle lay on its side, half hidden by fallen corn stalks. The front wheel still spun slowly, catching the weak autumn light. A silver thermos rested on the grass beside it, the lid unscrewed and the coffee inside still faintly warm. It was 7:42 a.m. on October 14, 1978, when a farmer named Thomas Reed noticed it while driving to his fields. He stopped his truck, thinking at first it was nothing more than a careless cyclist. But as he stepped closer, the quiet felt wrong. No footprints in the mud, no sign of anyone nearby. The air was cold, windless, and heavy with the scent of harvested corn. The bicycle was upright when he first saw it, as if someone had placed it carefully rather than dropped it. The seat was damp with dew, and the small leather satchel tied to the handlebar was unzipped, its contents scattered: a wallet, a book, a set of keys. Reed looked toward the open field and then back to the road. There was no movement. He returned to his truck and called the sheriff's office from his radio. Within 10 minutes, the first patrol car arrived. 2 officers stepped out, taking in the scene in silence before marking off the area with yellow tape. They began photographing the ground, the bike, and the items nearby. Sergeant David Holbrook, the first investigator on scene, crouched near the bicycle. He examined the grass flattened in a short, curved pattern, as if someone had slipped or been pulled off the path. But there were no drag marks, no blood, no tire tracks other than the bicycle's own. It was as if the rider had simply vanished mid-motion. A small crowd began to gather at the edge of the field: a mail carrier, 2 nearby residents, and a teenage boy who had been walking his dog. The boy said he often saw a woman riding that same road every evening after work. She always had a yellow backpack. The officers found it lying near the ditch, one strap torn, containing only a notebook and a folded receipt from a local bookstore. By 9 a.m., word spread through Bloomfield that something terrible had happened. Reporters had not arrived yet, but neighbors whispered from driveways and store windows. Police expanded the search radius, combing the fields in precise lines. The local fire department joined in, walking shoulder to shoulder through rows of dry corn, eyes scanning the ground for any trace. When they reached the creek half a mile east, they found a single shoe wedged between stones in the shallow water. It was a size 6 brown leather, with the sole slightly worn. Holbrook ordered it bagged immediately. It was the first real piece of evidence. A few feet downstream, one officer noticed faint indentations in the mud, impressions of bare feet. 2 steps, maybe 3, before the trail disappeared entirely. No one could say if they were fresh or old, but their direction pointed away from the road. As the morning stretched toward noon, tension thickened. Reporters arrived, snapping photographs of the marked-off area, while the sheriff briefed them with little to say. The name of the missing woman had not yet been released, but those nearby already knew. It was Elaine Porter, the young woman from the bookstore downtown. Inside her satchel, police found her employee badge and a library card. Nothing else. No sign of a struggle, no witnesses, no tire marks from another vehicle. Just a quiet stretch of rural road, one bicycle, and questions that multiplied with every hour. Holbrook looked across the field one last time before calling in additional units. He told the dispatcher to alert every county post and nearby jurisdiction. The woman's bicycle and personal items were to be treated as part of an active disappearance. By late afternoon, the light began to fade. The bicycle was loaded into the back of a police truck, tagged as evidence, and taken to the station. The thermos, still carrying the faint smell of coffee, was sealed in a plastic bag. As the last officers left the scene, wind swept through the cornfield, bending the stalks like whispers. The road was empty again, silent except for the faint hum of crickets returning with dusk. That night, when Sergeant Holbrook reviewed the photographs, one image stood out: the bicycle, untouched and upright, its front wheel angled slightly toward the horizon. It looked less like an accident and more like a message left behind. And by sunrise the next day, the small Illinois town of Bloomfield would wake to a single headline: "Young woman missing. Bicycle found abandoned near County Road 12. The search for Elaine Porter had begun." At 9 p.m., Elaine Porter locked the glass door of Hartley's bookstore and stepped into the quiet street. She adjusted the strap of her yellow backpack, placed her brown jacket tighter around her shoulders, and began cycling toward home. The streetlights flickered unevenly, and the sound of her tires on the pavement echoed against the empty storefronts. A bakery camera across the street captured her final moments in town. Elaine glancing once to her left, before pedaling into the darkness beyond Main Street. It was 9:11 p.m. She followed her usual route along County Road 12, a narrow stretch flanked by open fields and the occasional cluster of trees. The road was familiar to her. She had taken it every night for months, but that evening traffic was thin. The temperature had dropped, and fog had begun to form near the edges of the fields. At 9:25 p.m., a local resident, Samuel Burns, driving home from work, noticed a cyclist ahead of him. He slowed briefly and recognized Elaine's bright scarf. She turned onto the dirt shoulder to let him pass. It was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. When Elaine failed to return home that night, her brother Mark assumed she had stayed with a friend. It was not unusual for her to visit co-workers after closing, though she always called. By midnight, when there was still no sign of her, he began calling her friends. None had seen her. By morning, panic began to replace patience. At 7:42 a.m., farmer Thomas Reed discovered the abandoned bicycle near the roadside ditch, the same one later photographed by investigators. Elaine's yellow backpack was found a few feet away, unzipped, its strap torn. Her thermos stood upright beside it, still half full. The discovery marked the start of what would become one of Bloomfield's longest-running investigations. Within the hour, the area was cordoned off. Detectives arrived, and volunteers gathered to assist. Search dogs were brought in from 2 counties over. They began at the roadside, working outward in expanding circles. The dogs followed a trail for nearly 200 yards before stopping abruptly near the edge of the cornfield. There the scent disappeared. Helicopters hovered overhead, scanning the terrain with infrared cameras. Ground teams moved through rows of corn drainage ditches and the wooded strip along the creek. The search extended past noon but produced nothing. No clothing. No signs of a struggle. No footprints leading away. By afternoon, the sheriff's department began collecting statements from anyone who had driven through the area the previous night. Several motorists recalled seeing a bicycle light near mile marker 8 around 9:30. None remembered another car nearby. A truck driver passing through the intersection claimed he noticed something reflective near the ditch, but assumed it was trash. Investigators searched the entire stretch of County Road 12, marking each item found: a cigarette butt, a torn paper bag, a discarded glove. None linked to Elaine. That evening, officers returned to the Porter home. Elaine's bed was made, her clothes neatly folded. Her camera sat on the dresser beside undeveloped film rolls. Nothing was missing. Her wallet and keys had been recovered from the satchel near the bicycle. Detective Frank Dillard, who had recently been reassigned from a nearby county, took charge of the case. He reviewed every known detail from that night: time of departure, possible witnesses, weather conditions. He ordered luminol testing near the ditch and roadside, hoping to detect traces of blood. None appeared. Dillard noted one irregularity. On the bicycle's rear fender, faint scratches formed a pattern inconsistent with a fall. They appeared deliberate, as though something had scraped against the metal. He sent the bicycle for lab analysis. As daylight faded, the search operation scaled back. Volunteers lit lanterns and continued sweeping the creek until midnight. Police urged residents to check sheds, barns, and abandoned structures. By dawn, more than 40 people had joined the search effort. The results were the same: silence. Forensic teams expanded the perimeter over the next 2 days, but no physical trace emerged. The dogs, reintroduced on day 3, could not regain the scent. Heavy rain soon followed, erasing potential tracks or evidence. By the 4th day, investigators began to consider abduction. They studied maps showing entry points to the main highway, theorizing that a vehicle could have intercepted her along the unlit section of County Road 12. But without witnesses or camera footage, it was speculation. News of the disappearance spread quickly. Local radio described Elaine as a young woman last seen riding her bicycle home. Flyers appeared in shop windows, churches, and gas stations. Her photograph, a simple portrait with a soft smile, soon filled every corner of town. Despite the growing effort, every lead ended in the same emptiness. Each passing hour deepened the unease. Elaine Porter had vanished without sound or struggle, leaving behind only a bicycle, a backpack, and questions no one could yet answer. By the end of that first week, the investigation had exhausted its immediate options. The road where she was last seen remained taped off, but the fields were quiet again. The evidence collected filled a single cardboard box at the station. Detective Dillard looked at the case file and wrote one short note in the margin. No direction, no trace, and as the seventh day closed, one chilling fact became clear. Elaine Porter was not missing by accident. She was gone, and no one in Bloomfield knew where or why. The missing person report reached Detective Frank Dillard's desk just after dawn. Elaine Porter, 27 years old, last seen cycling home from the bookstore. No sign of struggle, no witnesses beyond a few scattered accounts. For Dillard, it was another late-night disappearance in a quiet town that was not supposed to have them. He was a methodical man, patient, and respected for his calm under pressure. But he was also exhausted. The county had seen 3 unsolved cases in 2 years, and the department was short on staff, short on equipment, and short on time. Still, Dillard drove out before sunrise, past the fog-covered fields, to the place where Elaine's bicycle had been found. The bike lay on its side in the ditch, front wheel bent, headlamp cracked. Her small cloth bag, the one she carried to work every day, was gone. The dirt around the area was disturbed, not enough for a struggle, but enough to suggest someone had been there after she fell or was forced off the road. Dillard marked the ground with chalk and told the patrol officers to preserve the scene. But there were already footprints from the passerby who had found it, and from the responding deputy who had picked up the bicycle before realizing it was evidence. The first 24 hours were critical. Dillard started with the people who knew Elaine best, her co-workers at the bookstore. They said she had closed up alone that night, same as always. She was careful, organized, not the kind to take risks. One employee remembered a man who sometimes waited for her outside, claiming to be a customer. She had brushed it off, saying he was harmless. Next came the family. Her parents were shaken, unable to believe anything had happened. Her younger brother remembered a conversation about a strange car that had followed her one evening a week earlier. The detail was vague, color uncertain, license plate forgotten. Dillard wrote it down anyway. Within days, the entire town was talking. Rumors spread faster than the official updates. Some said Elaine had argued with an ex-boyfriend who still lived nearby. Others swore a hitchhiker had been seen near County Road 12 the same night. Truck drivers passing through claimed to have seen a woman matching her description, walking along the road around 9:30 p.m., but none could say for sure it was her. The sheriff's office was flooded with calls, none reliable, most contradictory. Dillard kept a notebook full of names, tips, and theories, most of which would lead nowhere. He worked 16-hour days, trying to piece together a sequence of movements that never quite fit. Evidence collection in 1978 was limited. No DNA, no digital databases, no surveillance cameras. The lab could only test for blood types or match fibers by sight. The mud on Elaine's bicycle tires was scraped off and sent for testing, but the results showed nothing unusual. Her fingerprints were found only on the handlebars. No sign of another person's touch. Dillard grew frustrated with the inconsistencies. Some reports from patrol officers were incomplete. Others were lost before being filed. A local deputy had taken photographs of the ditch where the bicycle was found, but the film roll had been accidentally exposed during development. Another deputy admitted to using one of Elaine's personal items, a hairbrush, for a comparison sample without properly sealing it first. Small mistakes, but enough to damage the case's foundation. By the end of the first week, the search had expanded into the nearby woods. Volunteers combed through the brush calling her name, guided by tracking dogs and deputies with flashlights. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through the fog, but nothing surfaced. No clothing, no tracks, no body, only silence. Then came a lead, a mechanic named Henry Cole who lived less than 2 miles from where Elaine's bicycle was found. He had serviced her bike a few months earlier and was known to have spoken to her outside the shop more than once. A neighbor claimed to have seen his truck parked along County Road 12 on the night she vanished. Cole was quiet, polite, and cooperative when questioned. He said he had been home alone fixing an engine part. No one could confirm his alibi, but there was also nothing to directly connect him to Elaine's disappearance. Dillard searched his property. No blood, no clothing, no trace of her. Only the smell of oil and rust. Still, something about the man unsettled him. His answers were calm but too precise, as if rehearsed. When asked why he was seen near the county road, Cole said he sometimes drove there to test engines after repairs. It was plausible. It was also impossible to verify. Days turned into weeks. Leads dried up. The case that had once filled the sheriff's office with noise and urgency began to fade into paperwork and silence. Dillard sat in his car one evening, parked near the bookstore where it had all started. The shop's lights were still on. New employees, same hours, but something about it felt frozen in time. He knew he was missing something. A small detail, buried under errors and gossip. But until he found it, Elaine Porter was gone, and Henry Cole, the quiet mechanic with no proof against him, was the only name left on his list. The chapter closes not with resolution, but with a single unanswered question echoing through the investigation. If Henry Cole was innocent, then who had taken her? The posters went up before sunrise. Elaine Porter, missing since Tuesday night, her photograph printed in black and white taped to telephone poles, grocery windows, and gas station doors. By noon, everyone in Bloomfield had seen her face. The town had not seen a disappearance like this before. It was small, close-knit, and quiet. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. And now, suddenly, no one spoke above a whisper. In the first few days, church gatherings turned into community meetings. Volunteers arrived with maps and flashlights, forming search parties that spread through nearby fields and riverbanks. The local paper printed updates on the front page, quoting the sheriff's office and pleading for tips. Elaine's parents stood outside their home, thanking strangers who came to help. Each night they returned to a living room filled with cold coffee, reporters' notes, and unanswered questions. Candlelight vigils began by the end of the week. The first one drew hundreds. People held hands outside the bookstore where Elaine had worked, their faces lit by the soft orange glow. The owner placed a single white candle in the window, beside the register she used every night. No one spoke much. There was nothing left to say. But as the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. The posters stayed up, but their corners curled in the wind. The search parties grew smaller. People returned to work pretending things were normal, though nothing felt normal anymore. Fear had settled in quietly. Parents kept their children close. The roads emptied earlier than usual. Streetlights flickered over empty sidewalks. The bookstore started closing before dark, even though business was already slow. Elaine's absence had changed the rhythm of the town. Every open door now felt like a risk, every unknown face like a threat. At Sunday service, the pastor spoke about faith and patience, but the congregation listened with eyes lowered. Rumors had already replaced prayers. Some said the police were hiding something. Others blamed a drifter, a jealous ex, or a stranger passing through. Every theory spread faster than the facts, and none could be proven. Detective Dillard kept attending those gatherings quietly, standing at the back. He saw how the silence grew heavier each week, how it shifted from grief to frustration. The department released updates, but there was little new to say. They searched the nearby rivers, dredged the shallow edges, and combed through farmland miles away from County Road 12. They found nothing. By the third month, the newspaper had stopped running daily updates. Elaine's name moved from the headlines to the inside pages. Only her family and a few volunteers kept the effort alive, pinning new flyers over the old ones. At night, Bloomfield became a town that seemed to hold its breath. The chatter of summer evenings had vanished. People avoided the road where her bicycle was found. The ditch had been cleared and covered, but the unease remained. The community that once came together began to drift apart, united only by unanswered questions, and beneath that quiet surface, one thought kept returning to everyone's mind. If Elaine had vanished so easily, who might be next? The tip came from a gas station clerk 3 towns over. A man had walked in late at night, dirty, drunk, and rambling about the girl from Bloomfield. He said he knew what happened to her. Within hours, detectives had him in custody. He confessed, said he was the one who took Elaine Porter, but the story fell apart fast. His details did not match. He said it happened in a motel that did not exist, described roads that led nowhere near Bloomfield. His fingerprints did not match the ones lifted from Elaine's bicycle. By morning, he admitted he had made it up for attention and a warm meal. The first lead had collapsed, and with it, the team's early sense of progress. A week later came an anonymous letter. postmarked from Springfield, typed on plain paper. It claimed to know where the body was buried. The writer gave coordinates near an abandoned quarry 20 miles east. Dozens of officers, volunteers, and dogs searched the rocky ground for 2 days straight. Nothing surfaced, no traces, no clothing, no footprints. Forensics confirmed the letter was typed on a cheap typewriter sold at a local thrift shop. No fingerprints, no DNA, another dead end. The department tried to stay focused, but pressure was rising. Reporters crowded outside the station, asking whether the police were wasting time on bad tips. Detective Frank Dillard had worked missing persons before, but none that carried this much scrutiny. Every call, every rumor had to be checked. And each time the answer was the same: nothing. Then, in early December, a hunter found a piece of torn clothing near the old railway line west of town. It looked like something Elaine might have worn, a beige cardigan sleeve caught on a branch. The lab sent it for testing. For 2 days, Bloomfield held its breath. But when the results came back, they showed no link to Elaine. The fibers were different, the age older, and the pattern never sold locally. It belonged to someone else from some other story. Each disappointment chipped away at morale. The search teams grew smaller. The press stopped calling. Even the detectives started leaving the file untouched for days at a time, waiting for something new to appear. But nothing did. Dillard began reviewing the evidence again, and every report, every photo, every taped interview. That was when he noticed the gaps. One photograph mentioned in an early report was missing. A witness statement had been logged but not signed. Evidence tags did not match the chain of custody list. It looked like mistakes, maybe sloppiness, but Dillard could not shake the feeling that something more was wrong. He called in the evidence clerk, who said the paperwork was incomplete because of staff changes that fall. Another officer said the witness had moved out of state and could not be re-interviewed. It was a maze of small errors, each one explainable, but together they left too many questions. The detective marked the inconsistencies in red ink, thinking he could return to them later. But time was running out. Winter was setting in, and the leads had dried up completely. The volunteers had stopped showing up at the command post. Snow covered the cornfields where they once searched. By the end of the month, even the chief stopped asking for updates. The casebox was closed, labeled, and placed on a shelf beside a dozen others, unsolved, unfinished, and fading from memory. Detective Dillard wrote one final note before sealing the file. It was brief, only 6 words. By winter, the case had gone cold. The file sat untouched for years. Dust settled on the brown cardboard edges, and the ink on the label began to fade. Inside, photographs curled at the corners, paper clips rusted, and handwritten notes from 1978 turned yellow. The mystery of Elaine Porter became a name on a shelf, a story people once talked about, but no longer believed would ever be solved. Bloomfield moved on. The fields that had once been search zones filled again with tall corn each summer. The bookstore where Elaine worked changed owners twice and eventually closed. New families arrived, unaware of what had happened on that narrow road decades before. The old-timers remembered, though. They mentioned her name quietly at the diner or during church bake sales, as if speaking too loud might wake the ghosts of that autumn night. Elaine's photograph stayed pinned to the bulletin board inside the post office. The colors faded until her face looked almost sepia. Each December, someone, no one ever knew who, replaced the corner tack that had fallen loose. It became less a sign of an active investigation and more a reminder of something unsolved, something unfinished. Detective Frank Dillard retired in 1989. He boxed up his belongings, including one file he could not quite let go of, the Porter case. He told a colleague he kept it because he did not like endings without answers, but even he stopped looking through it after a few years. For him, like for everyone else, the silence had grown heavier than the evidence. Elaine's family tried to hold on. Her mother stopped giving interviews after the 5th anniversary. Her father passed away in the early 90s, still convinced the police had missed something. Her younger brother, Daniel, joined the army right after high school. He told friends he needed to leave Illinois because every corner looked like the place she vanished. He returned home as an adult, carrying medals and memories, but found the house empty and the town unfamiliar. By the late 1990s, the case was older than most of the officers on the force. Evidence handling had changed. Forensic science had evolved, but the Porter file was too small, too incomplete, and too degraded to revisit easily. Most believed that even if DNA testing could be done, there would be nothing left to find. The town itself changed shape. The local mill closed. The train station shut down. The road where Elaine's bicycle was found was repaved, straightened, and widened. Cars now sped past the ditch that once held her bike without knowing the story. The bridge near County Road 12 was replaced with concrete barriers, erasing the last visible trace of where the search teams had gathered. But silence does not erase memory. Every few years, a local newspaper would run a brief article, "Anniversary of disappearance still unsolved." The same photograph, the same timeline, a quote from the sheriff saying the case remained open, though no active leads existed. Readers would glance at the headline, maybe pause for a moment, then turn the page. Daniel Porter never stopped reading those small columns. He lived 2 towns away by then, working as a mechanic. Some nights he drove out to County Road 12 and parked near the tree line. He said it was the only place he felt close to her. Neighbors saw him there sometimes, sitting in silence with the engine running. He never told anyone what he was hoping to find. As the years passed, Bloomfield began to forget. Children grew up hearing the name Elaine Porter like a ghost story, something whispered to make them come home before dark. Teenagers dared each other to ride bicycles past the stretch of road where she vanished. The story became part of the town's folklore, half memory, half myth. Inside the police archives, the original evidence box remained sealed. The seal tape had turned brittle, the ink barely legible. But under the fading label, one thing was still clear. Porter Elaine. Missing 1978. No one could have known that 45 years later, that same box would be reopened. That inside, among the faded papers and forgotten reports, a small item overlooked in 1978 would spark the case back to life. But in those long, silent decades, Elaine Porter's name was just another unsolved mystery. A ghost story whispered in a town that had learned to stop asking questions. The silence was complete, until it wasn't. The box had been sitting untouched for nearly 40 years. On the label, the handwriting was faded, almost unreadable, Porter Elaine in 1983. It was March 2023 when Illinois State Police began re-examining a backlog of cold cases using new forensic tools. Hundreds of names passed through their database that month, but one would soon rise to the surface, a name that had once shaken a small town and then vanished into silence. Elaine Porter. Inside the evidence room, Detective Olivia Marsh watched as technicians opened the old casebox. The air smelled faintly of dust and paper, mixed with the sterile scent of the lab. Each item was catalogued again. Photographs, handwritten reports, a broken hair clip, and a fragment of Elaine's clothing that had been carefully sealed decades earlier. Back in the early 80s, DNA analysis was still a developing science. Samples were collected, but technology had not yet caught up. Many cases from that era were lost in time because of it. But now advances in trace DNA extraction meant that even the smallest fragment could hold the truth. The fabric sample, faded brittle from age, was placed beneath a modern microscope. Technicians used micro-sampling techniques to isolate potential skin cells. The work was slow, precise, and methodical. Every step was documented. Every tool was sterilized. After several attempts, a partial DNA profile emerged. It was faint but complete enough for a database search. The sequence was uploaded to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a network linking state and federal crime databases across the country. The system began scanning millions of profiles, comparing, cross-referencing, eliminating. Hours passed. Then a flag appeared on the screen. Match found. The DNA from Elaine's clothing matched a male profile already in the system. The record was from another state, Missouri. The name attached was Franklin Dale Cooper, a man in his late 60s with a long criminal history that included burglary and assault. Detective Marsh reviewed the file silently. Cooper had been arrested multiple times over the years, moving from one small town to another. He had served short sentences, but none had linked him to anything as serious as homicide. Until now, the discovery triggered immediate action. A case that had been frozen for decades was suddenly active again. The Illinois State Police Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation officially on April 12, 2023. Detective Marsh requested all archived materials, interviews, crime scene photos, autopsy notes, and the original reports from 1983. Many of the officers who worked the case were long retired. Some had passed away. The old handwriting, the smudged fingerprints on the paperwork, felt like a message from another time. Forensic teams reanalyzed every piece of remaining evidence. They retested the soil samples collected from Elaine's body and cross-referenced fiber traces with modern databases. Digital tools reconstructed the old crime scene using archived photos, allowing investigators to see details the original team might have missed: shoe prints, tire impressions, patterns of disturbance in the dirt. Meanwhile, Marsh contacted law enforcement in Missouri. Local officers confirmed that Cooper had lived in several counties across the state in the 1980s. At the time of Elaine's disappearance, he would have been in his mid-20s, working construction jobs and moving frequently. His record showed a pattern: offenses against women, break-ins involving personal items, late-night prowling arrests. Nothing that led to a major conviction, but enough to draw suspicion. Investigators began reconstructing his movements. They obtained old employment logs, vehicle records, and interstate traffic citations. One detail stood out: a 1983 speeding ticket issued in Illinois, only 30 miles from Elaine Porter's hometown. Just weeks before she vanished, Detective Marsh called it the missing thread, the detail that connected past to present. Still, the team knew that one DNA match was not enough for a conviction. They needed corroboration, evidence that placed Cooper at the scene beyond reasonable doubt. The next step was verification. Modern forensic labs require a secondary sample to confirm a DNA hit. A warrant was obtained to collect a fresh swab from Cooper, who was living quietly in a small town outside St. Louis. When the officers arrived, Cooper appeared calm. He had no idea his past was about to resurface. The swab was taken without incident, and the sample was rushed back to Illinois under secure chain of custody. Days later, the results arrived. Match confirmed. Probability of error less than 1 in a trillion. Detective Marsh stared at the report for a long moment. After 40 years, the identity of Elaine Porter's probable killer was finally known. But as investigators dug deeper into Cooper's background, they uncovered more questions than answers. His record showed unexplained gaps, periods where he disappeared completely. There were unsolved assaults in neighboring states that matched his profile, and whispers of a transient man seen near other missing persons cases from the same decade. It became clear that Elaine's murder might not have been an isolated act. It could be part of something larger, something that had remained hidden for years. As Marsh prepared the case file for the prosecutor's review, she knew that this was only the beginning. The science had spoken, but justice was still a long road ahead. 40 years of silence had ended, and the ghost of Elaine Porter was finally speaking again. But one question lingered in the air. Heavy and unresolved, if Franklin Cooper was the killer, how many others were there? The map on Detective Olivia Marsh's wall was filled with red pins. Each one marked a location connected to Elaine Porter's final night: the gas station, the old county road, the field where she was found. It had been months since the DNA match first surfaced, but Marsh was not ready to close the case. Something still did not fit. The name Franklin Dale Cooper explained the DNA match, but not the entire story. The recovered evidence from 1978 contained a partial secondary profile, one that did not belong to Cooper. For Marsh, that small anomaly was enough to reopen every report, every note, and every overlooked clue. She began by revisiting the old witness statements. Many were handwritten, recorded on thin carbon paper. Several witnesses were gone now, but their accounts remained: names, times, sightings. Marsh fed them into a digital case management system, linking them with new data sources: phone directories, property records, employment histories. Bit by bit, a clearer picture began to form. One detail caught her attention: a local mechanic, Royce Keller, who once worked a night shift only half a mile from where Elaine disappeared. His name appeared briefly in an old supplemental report, mentioned by a co-worker who had seen his truck parked along the same stretch of road that night. The report had been dismissed at the time. Keller had an alibi. He claimed to be working late, fixing a generator in the shop. But when Marsh pulled the original maintenance logs, there was no record of that repair. Keller was now 68 years old, living quietly in a small Illinois town. He had no major criminal history, only minor citations. Speeding, trespassing, a public disturbance in 1995. Nothing violent. Nothing that stood out. Marsh requested his DNA through a warrant. The lab processed it alongside the preserved material from Elaine's clothing. The results came back inconclusive but significant. A partial match to trace DNA found on her jacket in 1978. It was not a full profile, but it was enough to suggest contact. Marsh knew she needed more. She returned to the archives and began searching for Keller's old vehicles. The police records listed a 1976 Ford pickup, registered to his name at the time of Elaine's disappearance. The vehicle had never been seized, but through DMV history, Marsh discovered it had been sold in 1984 to a collector in Wisconsin. The collector, now elderly, still owned the truck. It had been stored in a barn for decades, preserved and rarely touched. When Marsh arrived to inspect it, she treated it as a crime scene frozen in time. The interior was dusty, the seats cracked with age, but the original fabric remained. Forensic technicians used modern micro-vacuum sampling to collect material from beneath the seat lining, a space rarely cleaned or disturbed. The process took hours. Every particle was carefully sealed, labeled and documented. Days later, the lab results arrived. Inside the foam lining of the passenger seat were microscopic fibers. Under magnification, they matched the weave and dye composition of Elaine Porter's jacket, a jacket last seen on her the night she vanished. It was the kind of finding that could not be explained away by coincidence. Marsh re-examined Keller's timeline, the mechanic shop records, the payroll slips, the statements from his old co-workers. Several showed inconsistencies. One colleague, re-interviewed through video call, admitted that Keller had left the shop for several hours that night. He said no one thought much of it at the time, because Keller often ran errands. The pieces began to fall into place. Keller had access to tools, vehicles, and the area surrounding the county road. He knew the terrain, the shortcuts, the back routes that avoided the main highway. Marsh filed for a search warrant of Keller's property. Ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs were brought in, scanning the backyard and garage. Nothing significant was found, but the recovered fibers from his truck were enough to classify him as a person of interest. When questioned, Keller denied knowing Elaine. He said he had never met her and had no idea why her clothing fibers might be in his truck. His tone was calm, his hands steady, but Marsh noticed small details, his avoidance of direct eye contact, the defensive posture when asked about 1978. Back at headquarters, Marsh reviewed the new DNA data alongside the old CODIS records. The results were clear. Franklin Cooper's DNA was the dominant profile, but Keller's partial trace connected him to the same evidence. It suggested two people may have been involved, one primary suspect, one accomplice. For decades, investigators had believed Elaine Porter's abduction was the work of a single man. Now Marsh faced the possibility of a pair, operating together, or perhaps one covering for the other. The discovery reignited every unanswered question in the case file. As night settled over the evidence lab, Marsh stared at the side-by-side photos on her desk. Elaine's school portrait, Keller's mugshot, and the faded image of that old Ford pickup. The past was no longer buried. It was speaking, piece by piece, through science and persistence. But the truth was still incomplete, and as Marsh prepared her next move, she realized the case had just shifted from solving a murder to uncovering a conspiracy that had been waiting in plain sight. The recording light blinked red. Detective Olivia Marsh sat across from Royce Keller in interview room 3. The walls were bare, the air still. On the table between them, a small evidence folder sat unopened. Keller looked older than his 68 years, pale, thin, eyes sunken behind thick glasses. He kept his hands folded, resting on the table, silent. Marsh began with the facts. She read from the report: the preserved jacket, the recovered fibers, the DNA partial match. Each piece was laid out carefully, like weights placed one by one on a fragile scale. Keller did not interrupt. His breathing stayed steady. Only his right hand trembled slightly, pressing against the cold metal surface. When she slid the lab report toward him, he finally looked up. The words DNA correlation and evidence reprocessed reflected off his glasses. He said nothing. For almost 12 minutes, Marsh spoke alone, recounting the timeline of Elaine Porter's disappearance, the false leads, the reopened file. She described the recovered truck, the microscopic fibers and the matching material. The room felt smaller with every sentence. Keller's first words were barely above a whisper. "That was a long time ago," he said. Marsh did not respond. She simply turned the folder around and opened it. Inside was a photograph, Elaine Porter's school portrait, taken weeks before she vanished. A young woman with bright eyes, smiling at a camera she never saw again. Keller stared at the picture for a long time. Then his voice changed, low, almost mechanical. "I saw her that night," he said. "She was walking by the road. It was late, cold." Marsh noted the words, her pen steady. "I stopped my truck," he continued. "I offered her a ride. She said no. Told me she was fine." He paused, pressing his lips together. I do not know what came over me. I got out. I tried to talk to her again. She backed away. I grabbed her arm. The confession came in fragments, halting, broken by silence. "She screamed," he said. "I panicked. I told her to stop, but she kept trying to run. I pushed her. She fell." He stopped speaking. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent light above them. Marsh leaned forward slightly. "What happened next?" Keller's voice cracked for the first time. "She hit the ground. I thought she was still breathing. I tried to lift her, to put her in the truck, but she went still. I did not mean to kill her." The sentence hung in the air like a slow echo. Marsh wrote every word. She did not interrupt, did not react. The procedure required clarity, not emotion. She asked him where it happened. He described the side road near Miller's Bridge, the same stretch investigators had searched 45 years earlier. He said he left her body by the riverbank, covered it with brush and drove away. When asked why he never came forward, Keller stared at the wall. "Because I thought it was my fault, and I knew no one would believe it was an accident." He had lived his life quietly afterward. Moved towns, married once, worked odd jobs until retirement. But every time her name appeared in old newspaper anniversary pieces, he avoided reading them. "It never left me," he said. It never stopped. The interview lasted 3 hours. Every statement was recorded, every pause transcribed. Keller signed the written confession without protest. Outside the interrogation room, Marsh watched through the glass as he sat alone. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not ask for water. He simply kept his eyes on the table, the same spot where Elaine's photograph had been moments earlier. When news of the confession reached Bloomfield, it spread fast. The same streets that once held vigils, now filled with quiet disbelief. Elaine's case had haunted generations, turning into a story parents told their children as warning. Now it was over, but the truth brought no comfort. Detective Marsh filed the official report that evening. Her statement described the confession as calm, voluntary, and consistent with the physical evidence. She included Keller's closing words exactly as he said them. "I did not mean to kill her." Those 6 words carried the weight of 45 years of silence. By the next morning, local media had gathered outside the precinct. Reporters stood in the cold, speaking into cameras as the town behind them tried to process what had been uncovered. Elaine Porter's family, now scattered across different states, received the call they had waited for their entire lives. There were no tears in the press release, no emotional statements. Only one line from her brother, written simply, "We finally know." In the official transcript, Marsh ended her summary with a single sentence, plain, factual, final. On the night of February 12, 1978, Royce Keller encountered Elaine Porter and caused her death through unlawful restraint and assault. He admitted responsibility after 45 years, but the confession did not close the case completely. In the DNA file, one trace remained unresolved, the secondary, partial male profile that did not belong to Keller. As Marsh reviewed the lab report once more, she realized the story might not be over. There was still one more name missing from the truth. The handcuffs clicked just after sunrise. Royce Keller stood on the front steps of his small ranch-style home, surrounded by Illinois State Police officers. He did not resist. He simply raised his hands, his face pale against the morning light. The neighborhood was silent, except for the steady hum of police radios. Word spread within minutes. Neighbors stepped out onto porches, wrapped in coats and disbelief. Keller had lived among them for decades. fixing engines, mowing his lawn, waving to mail carriers. Now he was being led away for murder. The arrest report listed the charge formally, homicide, first degree. But in Bloomfield it carried a simpler meaning. After 45 years, Elaine Porter's killer had finally been found. Detective Olivia Marsh watched from the driveway as Keller was placed in the back of a squad car. His eyes stayed forward, focused on nothing. No one spoke. The sound of gravel under boots filled the air. When the car door closed, it echoed down the quiet street like the end of a long story. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Local channels, online headlines, national outlets. Arrest made in 1978 cold case. Old photographs of Elaine resurfaced, grainy but bright, her face familiar again to those who had long forgotten. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, their cameras pointed at a town that had become the setting of a crime finally solved. Inside the precinct, Marsh finalized the paperwork. Keller's confession, the DNA report, the recovered truck seat, all of it lined up neatly in the case file. The words "closed, core cleared by confession" were stamped in red. But the feeling was not victory. It was quiet exhaustion. When news reached Elaine's brother, he booked a flight to Illinois the same day. He was 63 now, gray-haired, deliberate in movement, but still carried the same burden he had as a boy. He had been 10 when she disappeared. Now, after decades of silence, he was returning to face the man who had taken her away. The hearing took place 3 days later in a small county courtroom. The benches were full. Former classmates, retired officers, and residents who had lived through the search all those years ago. Reporters sat pressed together, notebooks open, waiting for the first words to be spoken. Keller was brought in through the side door, hands cuffed, wearing a plain beige jumpsuit. He did not look at the crowd. He only nodded slightly when asked to confirm his name. His lawyer stood beside him, silent. Detective Marsh sat in the second row, file in her lap, watching the proceedings unfold. The judge read the charges slowly, each one heavy with time. Unlawful restraint, homicide, tampering with evidence. Keller's responses were short, mechanical. "Yes, Your Honor." Elaine's brother sat in the front row. He had brought one thing with him, a framed photograph. It was the same image that had hung in their family home for decades. Elaine at 23, smiling softly, wearing a light sweater. He placed it gently on the wooden bench beside him. When the judge confirmed that Keller would be held without bail pending trial, the room stayed silent. No applause, no shouts, just the quiet hum of an overhead vent, and the weight of 45 years collapsing into a single moment. Outside, cameras flashed as officers escorted Keller to a waiting van. He did not look back. For Bloomfield, justice had arrived, but it did not feel like celebration. It felt like closure wrapped in grief, the kind that comes when an old wound finally stops bleeding, but never truly heals. Detective Marsh returned to her office that evening and placed the Porter file back in storage. The box was heavier now, filled with new reports, photographs, and signatures. She labeled it Resolved 2023. Before turning off the light, she paused. On her desk sat a copy of that same photograph, Elaine smiling in her bookstore uniform. Marsh stared at it for a moment, then whispered softly to the empty room, "We got him." The next morning, the courtroom photograph appeared in newspapers across the state, a single frame of quiet justice. Elaine's photo resting on the bench, sunlight touching the glass. 45 years late, but finally, it had arrived. The case file closed with a sound that felt heavier than paper should allow. Detective Sarah Marsh signed her name on the final page, then paused. The report was complete. Every fact, every test result, every chain of custody confirmed. Yet in the silence of the evidence room, it did not feel like an ending. For Marsh, this case had been more than an investigation. It had been a conversation across time, between the living and the lost. The DNA sample, the recovered fibers, the preserved photographs, they had all carried fragments of a voice that had been quiet for 45 years. And through technology, that voice had finally been heard. Elaine Porter's story had once been confined to a yellowing police folder tucked behind unsolved robberies and forgotten leads. Her name had become a case number. But science had changed that. A single preserved trace, stored carefully decades ago, had survived long enough to speak the truth. Marsh wrote one final note before sealing the file. Every trace tells a story, even after decades. Outside the precinct, the town was quiet again. Reporters had left. Police tape had been cleared. Life had already started to move on, as it always does once the cameras disappear. But some wounds, like Elaine's story, remained part of the town's landscape, unseen yet permanent. Residents still drove past the wooded stretch of highway where her car was found. Some slowed down without realizing it. Others avoided that road entirely. For those who remembered, justice had come, but it had come with the ache of time, the reminder that truth, though delayed, does not die. Detective Marsh revisited the evidence board one last time. The photographs, the maps, the scribbled notes, they had once been pieces of chaos. Now they formed a pattern that told a complete story. Elaine's last night, Royce Keller's confession, and the years of silence in between, all connected by persistence and by the patience of evidence that never forgot. The weight of time was something Marsh often thought about. Evidence degraded, witnesses aged, and memories blurred, but somewhere in every cold case, there was always one detail that survived. A fingerprint, a fiber, a forgotten statement, waiting for someone to see it differently. In this case, that survivor had been a strand of DNA, invisible to the naked eye, but powerful enough to outlast generations. It carried the truth through years of dust and neglect until the right hands finally uncovered it. Elaine's family had waited too long to see this day. Her brother, now an old man, had returned to attend the final hearing. He had stood outside the courthouse, staring at the doors for a long time before walking in. Inside, on the bench beside him, he placed a small framed photograph. Elaine, at 23, smiling, unaware of what history would take from her. When the sentence was read, there were no cheers, no sense of triumph, only quiet breathing and the sound of a gavel. For everyone in that room, justice had not felt like victory. It had felt like relief, slow, heavy, and irreversible. Marsh later described it in her notes. Justice, when delayed, does not arrive loud. It arrives tired but true. As she left the office that evening, she looked at the sunset fading over the town. Somewhere beyond those hills, time continued its indifferent march. But beneath it, in the archives of memory and data, truth waited, patient, unchanging, and ready to be found. Elaine's name would never return to a case number again. Her story would now live inside the records that prove that time can hide the truth. But it cannot erase it, and in the dim light of the evidence room, a single file rested quietly on the shelf, marked closed, not forgotten, just finally heard. Chapter 12. Final reflection, the weight of time, 600 words. The report was finished. Detective Sarah Marsh placed her signature on the last page and closed the folder that had lived on her desk for nearly 3 years. It did not feel like closure, only stillness. The air in the office was quiet, filled with the faint hum of the lights and the weight of everything that had led to this point. On the cover, a single name, Elaine Porter. For decades, that name had existed only in an archive box, dusted once a year, opened by no one. Time had nearly buried it. Yet a fragment of DNA, carefully stored and nearly forgotten, had waited silently through the years. When new technology met that old evidence, the truth rose to the surface like something unwilling to stay buried. Marsh leaned back in her chair, reading her own handwritten line before sealing the file. Every trace tells a story. Even after decades, it was a reminder to herself and to whoever would one day take her place that the past never fully disappears. Outside the station, the town of Bloomfield had returned to normal. The camera crews were gone. The headlines had faded. But for those who had lived with the case in their memories, the resolution brought a strange kind of silence, not peace, but understanding. The wooded road where Elaine's car had been found was still there. Locals passed it every day without speaking. Some slowed as they drove by, others looked away. No one needed to mark it with a sign. Everyone already knew what had happened there. Marsh visited that spot once more before the case was archived. The trees had grown taller, the asphalt repaired. Time had softened the scene, but it had not erased it. She stood at the edge of the clearing and thought about all the years that had passed between the crime and its answer. 45 years. Long enough for lives to end, for families to rebuild, for truth to wait patiently in silence. Inside the precinct, the evidence board had been taken down. Photographs that once formed a wall of mystery now lay neatly stacked inside the file. Each one represented persistence, every officer, every technician, every small discovery that had carried the case across generations. It was technology that had given Elaine her voice back. What could not be spoken in 1978 had been proven in 2023. The difference was science, but also something more human, the refusal to let a name disappear. Marsh often thought about how easily stories could fade when time stretched too far. Witnesses moved away, memories blurred, files went missing. Yet in every cold case something endured. A fingerprint, a strand of hair, a trace of truth too stubborn to vanish. Elaine's family had carried that endurance. Her brother, now grey and slow-moving, had stood in court as the verdict was read. His eyes did not show relief, only quiet exhaustion. When asked for comment, he said nothing. He simply placed his sister's photograph on the table in front of him and left it there as the room emptied. Justice had come, but it had not healed. It had only balanced the weight of what was lost. When Detective Marsh walked out of the station that night, she carried the final file to the evidence archive. She slid it onto a metal shelf, next to hundreds of others, and switched off the light. In the darkness, the shelves stood silent, rows of unfinished stories, waiting for their turn to be heard. Somewhere among them, another trace waited, unseen, untouched, patient, because time does not erase truth. It only delays it.